Okay, so the title of this special issue, New Queer South, may be an invitation to think about these very terms, New Queer South, and their juxtaposition. So they might be worth asking what this South is, especially through its queerness. Most importantly, what its presumed newness might entail. The preceding position of new and queer in the formulation New Queer South suggests arguably a qualifying function as adjectives. And adjectives, of course, provide specifications. In this case, though, they make possible the implication that the South by itself might not be queer or not queer enough. So hence the need for this specification. Eliding such specification may suggest that the South, in its generality, is intrinsically heteronormative, heterosexuality and its normative apparatus being a default aspect of its presumed ontology. So under these terms, the South might be in need of being rescued, might be in need of being queered. One problem I see with this possible scenario is how closely aligned it seems to kind of colonial construction of the South as socially and historically backward, a South at the periphery of modernity that has not yet fully embraced progress. In this sense, the queer, the new queer of this title may be considered as part of those forces of modernization, taking the South by hand, escorting it through its transition towards progress. So I see the juxtaposition New Queer South as potentially troubling. In a book titled Potential History, Unlearning Imperialism, Ariella Aisha Azoulay teaches us that the new is the marker of the imperial movement of progress. So the new for Azoulay is both an aspiration and a practice that carries potentially a destructive force. So I want to ask here, what if the South were already queer, even before being queered? What if queer were already a kind of lingering trace within and across the South, rather than a fellow of the new? So in thinking about these two terms, queer and South, together, I want to propose the possibility for queer to be disjoined from identitarian and minoritarian regimes, to be disjoined from its conflation with the category LGBT+, and the liberal discourse of rights and recognition that has come to define this conflation. So what if we took queer as an open, unruly mode of thinking, mode of critique, and world-making projects, as people like Michael Warner, Lauren Berlant, and others have invited us to do? What if we embraced queer, following Judith Butler's proposal, for its radical relational potential, as a mode of affiliation potentially open to everyone? I think we all agree that the work of Franco Cassano has been especially influential for the way we think about the South today, especially in Italy and for Italian studies scholars. There is a passage in Pensiero Meridiano, the book that has been translated in English as Southern Thought, in which Cassano proposes to think not about the South in the light of modernity, but about modernity in the light of the South. And here I want to play a bit with Cassano's formulation and propose not to think about the South in the light of queer, but to think about the queer in the light of the South. So in this sense, I would like to underscore the potential queerness of the South, the potential of the South to constitute already a source of queerness and a resource for queer. In other words, I'd like to suggest the possibility for the South to even interrogate and enrich the category of queer, so that we may start asking questions such as, what does queer look like from the point of view of the South, for example? The South that Franco Cassano writes about is, of course, the Mediterranean. It's a South that exists at the periphery of Europe. It's a South that interrogates the arrogance and the imperial foundations of the violence of the global North. And this is not just physical military violence, it's also an epistemological violence, as post-colonial scholars have taught us. Now, we could think of the South as a subnational South, as some of the contributors of these special issues are doing, as Mezzogiorno, for example, in Italy. But the alternative is to think about the South as kind of counter-hegemonic geography that resists and aspires to exist in contradistinction to the dominant imaginary of the nation. So this is a kind of South to be, a queer Mediterranean, I want to propose, to be conceived and imagined as a speculative geography. And for the remainder of this video, I'd like to turn to the Mediterranean beach as a kind of potential archive for thinking about kind of these aspirations and modes of resistance. In particular, I'd like to turn to a photo that has been haunting me for quite some time. On September 30, 2013, the bodies of 13 migrants trying to reach Europe from the northern coast of Africa washed ashore on the Sicilian beach of San Pieri. In one of the photos that circulated online, their bodies appear, as you can see, covered by white sheets and lined up on the sand. According to some journalistic accounts, the 13 individuals were coming from Eritrea and were forced to throw themselves in the water when their boat got stranded in the sand, only 20 meters away from the beach. The photo complies with a familiar protocol of visual evidence on the necropolitics of Fortress Europe, one that presents faceless, quantifiable bodies under white sheets to be pitied, but not really mourned, their relation to the observer having been emptied of any particular embodied form of recognition and sense of responsibility. The photo seems to have been taken from the dunes surrounding the beach, scarcely visible within the frame. The dunes are a well-known cruising site. Here I want to ask the following question. What would it mean to shift the orientation of the camera, which took that photo, in order to reveal and acknowledge the proximity between the cruising site and the deathly scenario of September 30th? So this is going to be a kind of speculative inquiry. Because of the position from which the photo was taken, the photo orients the attention of the observer in a certain direction, enacting a particular way of looking, and arguably a particular way of feeling at what appears within the frame, suggesting the terms of a relation between us, observers, bystanders, and what we're looking at. So to turn the camera by reorienting it towards the dunes, to even think about cruising in relation to these lifeless bodies may strike one as obscene. So the obscene, we are reminded, is what is normally kept or ought to be kept off scene. The orientation of the camera looking down from the dunes may then indicate to us the most appropriate way of looking, as well as the most suitable disposition towards what happened on this beach. Now, I like to consider the beach, specifically the Mediterranean beach, as the site of an encounter between the necropolitics of the European border regime and the leisure activities of the recently institutionalized queer subject. So the site mediates the current opposite global trajectories of queer politics and of the politics of border security, with LGBT plus subjects increasingly incorporated within neoliberal regimes of rights and recognition, and with the figure of the migrant increasingly stigmatized and presented as a threat to national economies, welfare systems, and community safety. The encounter unfolds on a site such as the Mediterranean beach, where Europe today is forced to face the ghosts of its colonial past, as waves of largely uncontrollable arrivals of migrants reach its southern shores. So, as obscene as the gesture of reorienting the camera on the beach of St. Pierre may seem, acknowledging a relation between the cruising site and the scene of migrant death allows the recognition of what I call a spectral proximity that implicates queerness within the scene. By spectral proximity, I refer to a form of intimacy that bypasses, even challenges, common sense arrangements of time, space, and history. And here, the specter that I invoke to qualify this proximity, aptly, I think, conjures up an etymological association to visibility, both insofar as it articulates the problem and promise of what is not visible but still present as a trace. And drawing on Elizabeth Freeman's work, especially the book titled Time Binds, I understand such a mode of proximity as a counter-politics of encounter, through which bodies, affects, social practices, reconfigured and rearranged, meet one another by chance, forging affiliations, making history differently, even counterfeiting it. By summoning the category of the spectral, I turn to the figure of the ghost as a mode of observation and an approach to time that challenges the dominant modern belief that past, present, and future are both distinct and sequential. So, as a mode of historical attention, the spectrals attunes us to what does not appear visible, but still manifests itself as a voice or a figure in the shadow. The term proximity typically describes the state of being near, in time and space. It suggests co-presence, spatial adjacency, and even a sequential sense of temporal progression. It conjures up an intimacy of the commensurable, the familiar. The proximate is also that which is immediately preceding or following. Now, by contrast, spectral proximities attunes us to queer forms of intimacy. Transhistorical, yet spatially mediated relations between terms that may not be immediately understood as mutually implicated. These intimacies violating sanctioned boundaries between the known and the alien, between what is conventionally understood as close or far. Two worlds are colliding on the beaches of the Mediterranean. This is the subheading of a 2015 article featured in the German newspaper Der Spiegel. The article describes an uncomfortable encounter taking place on the shores of the Mediterranean between vacationers looking for relaxation on the beaches of Lampedusa, Malta, and Kos, and the arrivals on the same beaches by boat of migrants seeking relief from poverty and warfare. The Spiegel explains that despite the efforts of hotels' owners and mayors to keep the tourists and the migrants apart, the scene featuring migrants making their way ashore among sunbathing tourists has become a familiar one. The scene sheds light on the intimacies connecting two of the most significant manifestations of today's globalization, namely international tourism and migration. So, staged on the Mediterranean beach, such intimacies spatialize the contingent convergence of awkward relationalities, the encounter collision on the Mediterranean beach, documented by the Spiegel, epitomizing an expanding split between those who are encouraged to travel and those whose right to mobility is being denied. Now, the scenario described by the Spiegel echoes aspects of the journalistic narrative accompanying the photo of the beach of St. Pierre, particularly through the use of witness testimonies. The narrative describes how tourists and lifeguards first spotted the approaching boat in the early morning. One report quotes a lifeguard's reaction. "I immediately told myself, oh my God, these are illegal immigrants." So note how the entrance of the migrants within this scenario occurs through what is at once an act of seeing and of knowing, immediately tied to the right to be on the beach. So this twofold gesture could be read as an act of interpellation that subjectivizes the object of the lifeguard's gaze as one that has already breached the law through their mere appearance in the scene. So here I want to suggest that the Mediterranean beach appears constructed as a site of colonial encounter. By colonial encounter, I do not mean an encounter between colonizer and colonized, rather an encounter with an alterity, an otherness, that is also the construction of that otherness. An encounter that has its matrix in the European project of colonial expansion, that is to say, in the encounter with native populations and via the process of classification, categorization, and separation by which the European self understands itself in opposition to the colonized as a kind of justification for domination. The coloniality of the encounter within the photo of St. Pierre is constructed through the way of seeing that is embedded in the photo, and further reinforced by the use of testimonies. This way of seeing generates an otherness that is cast as territorially external and threatening to the spatial integrity of a European collective self, one that, of course, aligns here with the perspective of the subject of vision. Through its visualization, the encounter does not merely reflect a pre-existing difference between those already on the beach and those approaching it. Rather, it actively produces and solidifies that distinction. The cruising site on the beach of St. Pierre appears mentioned since the mid-90s in the Spartacus International Gay Guide. That's the most popular publication serving international gay travelers, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s. The 90s are a decade during which the relation between the market and queer people changes, with the discovery of what is presented during these years as an especially profitable new niche market for global corporations, that of gay consumers with considerable disposable income. So during the decade that marks the explosion of gay capitalism, the tourist industry invests significantly in the interpellation of a global gay citizen whose unlimited freedom to move around the world ideally matches the promises of globalization, of a borderless world, of unlimited mobility and opportunity. So these developments have had a significant impact on the relation between the Mediterranean beach and queer socialization, with the mass touristification of gay-friendly destinations such as Mykonos, Barcelona, Sitges, and Tel Aviv. So following the gesture of reorienting the camera, the spectral absence of queer bodies on the dunes of St. Pierre thus evokes a past in which cruising in remote locations, such as beaches, was a response to common experiences of persecution, harassment, and violence, while cueing to a present where the ghost of queer death seems to have been eclipsed by the promises provided by capitalism and by the nation state. So elusively staged on the beach of St. Pieri, these seemingly disjoint temporalities illustrate a radical shift for queer subjects within the imaginary of neoliberal globalization from subjects of death, think about the AIDS crisis and the murderous response of many governments to this crisis during the 80s and the 90s, to becoming tied to ideas of life and productivity. Think about gay marriage, right to adoption, and access to reproduction technologies in the 21st century in several countries around the world. Jasbir Puar has argued that what she calls the sanctioning of queer subjecthood is a historical shift condoned only through a parallel process of demarcation from populations targeted for segregation, disposal, or death. Here, I think Puar provides us with a possible interpretative frame for thinking about the spectral proximity that may bind the scene of migrant death with the leisure activities of the institutionalized queer subject on the beach of St. Pieri. And it is a frame that commits to a relational reading. Such a reading would, for example, place the cruising of the international gay tourist on the rocky beaches of Mykonos and the gay cruises taking affluent holidaymakers around the Mediterranean in relation to the helpless drifting of migrant boats intercepted by the Greek Coast Guard and illegally pushed back to Turkey, something that's been widely documented, highlighting the mutual imbricatedness of these seemingly distinct scenarios. So what may thinking about such imbricatedness yield? To answer this question, I turn to Jean Arita Warren, who argues that some new forms of recognition and inclusion inevitably leave others behind. And Arita Warren urges us to consider these entanglements through the notion of queer regeneration. It's a concept that highlights shifting symbolic and material values over time in determining who is deemed worthy of intimacy, protection, and safety. So to inquire about the regenerations now framing queer subjects as worthy of intimacy, protection, and safety involves asking what else is going on and who else is in the scene. So attending to these dynamics means to pay attention to how certain queer bodies become a lovely sight in the shadow of racialized others, such as the recently manufactured figure of the homophobic Muslim. So like the speculative reorientation of the camera gaze on the beach of St. Pieri, to ask what else is going on and who else is in the scene is to approach a scene by bringing into view a set of relations involving terms which projects invested in separation and identitarian atomization may push us to understand as unrelated or in competing opposition. It is, in other words, to consider how current promises of inclusion, rights, and equality may be bound up in necropolitical orders. So the relational mode of entanglement that I've called spectral proximity may be another way of naming a methodology attuned to tracing the material construction of images and the unearthing of a set of buried spatial temporal relations which become accessible in the form of hauntings. To conclude, I'd like to reconsider the implications of that inappropriate turn of the camera gaze towards the cruising site. I return to the relational spectral proximity that I have proposed for the photo of the beach of St. Pieri, so a spatially inflected relation of closeness between terms which might not appear present at the same time, where the visible presence of one has been pushed off scene, but which might still be felt. This is a queer relation, an incongruous form of affiliation that implicates in and connects to something beyond oneself, beyond one's sanctioned identification and socially recognized domain of attachment. So I've tried to explore some of the possibility around what we may call a political ethics of commonality that disavows any stable positioning of a proper subject, a fixed political referent. If this spectral proximity is indeed also a queer relation, then its queerness entails a reconfiguration of what and who can be considered appropriate subjects and subject matters of queer critical inquiry. I've also tried to unearth a capacity for intimacy embedded in the sediments of the Mediterranean beach. On the dunes of St. Pierre, cruising can then be understood as a spectral practice of public intimacy, one that redeploys the traces of the oppression on which it was originally based to forge in the present renewed possibilities for relations with anonymous others. How? By drawing on the very improper forms of affiliation on which such a practice, cruising, has been historically shaped and experienced. The beach is a zone of horizontality, one that fosters unpredictable, experimental, lateral connections. This horizontality both invites and valorizes an intimacies of parataxis, calling for ways of looking and thinking adjacently, both in space and time. So these are contextualizing reading gestures, aiming at making apprehensible a set of relations that are not graspable simply by looking at a scene. The horizontality of the beach calls for practices of reading sideways, acts of juxtaposition, and of weaving together seemingly unrelated terms and often disjunctively situated temporalities. Thank you for listening.